President Lee Jae Myung and his Vietnamese counterpart Tô Lâm are sitting down for their summit in Hanoi on this Wednesday. We have more in Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Wednesday, April 22nd. I'm Min Sunhee. Leaders from South Korea and Vietnam are poised to sit down for their second summit in less than a year today, this time in the city of Hanoi. For more on this, I have Steven Borowiec from Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
I also have Professor Kim Dong-yeob at the Korean Institute for ASEAN Studies at the Busan University of Foreign Studies. Professor Kim, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Stephen, we shall start here in the studio. So President Lee Jae Myung and his Vietnamese counterpart Tô Lâm are soon slated to sit down for their summit in Hanoi, as I mentioned at the start. What appear to be the issues that look to top their talks based on the media reports leading up to this particular summit?
Well, I would just take a step back. I would just say that some viewers might be surprised to hear that Vietnam is actually South Korea's third largest trading partner. So this is a relationship that has really blossomed in recent years. It's like these are two countries that I think have found that they have a lot of overlap in their interests, and they found that they've been able to get along really well. So I would say that when President Lee and Tô Lâm sit down today, the contours of the meeting, I imagine, will be building on and maintaining those positive areas of growth that they've established in recent years, while also touching upon new ways that they can cooperate to address some of the new and pressing challenges in the global order. So just to talk about like what they have in common, these are both kind of energy vulnerable countries that are got to be concerned about possible disruptions to supply chains in the world right now. These are like non-petroleum producing energy importing countries that have a large manufacturing sector. So I imagine they'll talk about that. And I just beyond that, like the bigger themes of relationship between these two sides is that Vietnam is a growing economy. It's one of the faster emerging economies in the world, and it has a growing middle class. And it has a lot of demand for services that South Korean firms can provide. A lot of South Korean companies are quite adept at infrastructure development. I understand that Vietnam is looking to expand its rail network, and there are some South Korean firms who are quite experienced in that era. Nuclear power is another question. I think that the Vietnamese government has made announcements about wanting to expand in that area. And as we know, South Korea is an exporter of nuclear power infrastructure. And so I imagine that, as I said, there are bigger ongoing things that the two sides will look to build on, while also seeing if they can cooperate in kind of patching the holes that seem to be emerging in the global economy nowadays.
And before we delve deeper into the summit today, Professor Kim, could you walk us through the diplomatic and trade relations between South Korea and Vietnam over the past years?
All right. Well, the South Korea and Vietnam has gone from being enemies during the Cold War period to becoming the best of friends. The two countries normalized diplomatic ties in 1992 and have stepped up mutual relationship through several stages, finally reaching the highest level, the comprehensive strategic partnership in 2022. When it comes to economy, Vietnam is now South Korea's third largest trade partner, right after China and the US. In 2025 alone, bilateral trade volume hits nearly $95 billion. Vietnam is also South Korea's primary investment destination. The investment paradigm has shifted from labor-intensive industries to high-tech sectors, including semiconductors, displays, and smartphones. Over 10,000 Korean companies operate in Vietnam, and they contribute over 25% of Vietnam's total export these days. So it's quite close mutual relationship these days.
Right, I see. Stephen, meanwhile, the first foreign leader to be hosted by the Lee Jae Myung administration upon entering office last June was the Vietnamese leader. Could you remind us about some of the key agreements between these two leaders during their first summit last August?
Well, the headline one was that they pledged to increase their bilateral trade to $150 billion on an annual basis over the next 5 years. And just for context, that number, the level of bilateral trade was $86.7 billion in 2024. So you're talking about not quite doubling it, but almost doubling bilateral trade in a period of 5 years. It's quite an ambitious goal. But as Professor Kim just laid out there, like there already is a fairly robust framework in place for making that happen, because there are thousands of South Korean companies that are already present on the ground in Vietnam. There's a lot of manufacturing taking place there, higher value added goods, you know, not just light manufacturing, not just labor intensive things, but a lot of higher tech items that have higher profit margins. The kind of, I guess, a bit of context there might be that some South Korean companies have relocated out of China over the past several years, and Vietnam has been an attractive destination to them. So whether or not they'll be able to realize that goal, it is ambitious, but I think high on the agenda for Lee and Tô Lâm today will be seeing that South Korean companies can continue to have smooth and easy access to the Vietnamese market, and that they have a strong infrastructure in place with enough electricity, enough water, all the things that they need to do business, and a reliable regulatory framework. So I think along the sides of this summit, there will probably be a lot of kind of working level discussions among bureaucrats, like seeking ways that South Korea can, more easily deploy their human resources to the country, having, smooth visa processing, smooth customs processes, all the kind of stuff that doesn't get headlines, but is really integral to an economic relationship like this.
Right, of course. Professor Kim, President Lee Jae Myung, he is the first foreign leader to be hosted by the Tô Lâm administration following its re-election earlier this year. What makes this particular summit between the two leaders significant?
Well, the summit carries profound diplomatic weight as a meeting between the two relatively new leaders. President Tô Lâm decision to invite the Korean leader as his first foreign guest following his re-election underscores the special relationship that currently defines bilateral ties. Convened immediately after significant domestic development in Vietnam, namely the stabilization of political leadership and the sweeping reorganization of administrative divisions. This summit marks a decisive turning point for both countries in addressing major strategic challenges amid heightened global uncertainties. Politically, this meeting reflects a convergence between Vietnam's flexible diplomacy, often referred to as bamboo diplomacy, and Korea's pragmatic diplomacy, which seeks to secure regional strategic autonomy in the face of intensifying great power competition. Both nations are positioning themselves as mutual contributors to regional peace and stability.
Right, and speaking about the global uncertainties that Professor Kim alluded to, Stephen, for the sake of context, what have been the ripple effects of the unrest in the Middle East for Vietnam?
Similar that we've seen in a lot of countries. I mean, when the price of energy goes up, it has a lot of different potential hurdles. I've read that the price of diesel is something that's really acute in Vietnam because a lot of people get around on motorbikes. And just the prices of food and the prices of everything that anybody needs to live. Just my own analysis is I think that the timing element is kind of interesting for Vietnam here because this is a country that is in the process of building a middle class that's like kind of in the transition from a mostly agrarian society to a more urbanized, a more manufacturing-led society. And so if you have a prolonged disruption at a time like this, it could potentially have like really serious long-term effects. And a big part of the reason I say this is my Nikkei Asia colleague, Lee Jae Myung, just recently did some interesting reporting from Vietnam where she reported on the phenomenon of mortgages being kind of new in Vietnam, that in the country, up until now, it was kind of customary that like the way that you bought a home was you saved up enough cash, like literal cash, not money in the bank, and then you went and you paid for the house up front. That like taking out a large loan and then paying it back in order to own a home over a course of years or decades was a kind of unconventional thing there. It's something that people are just starting to do now. And so this is just the kind of thing that I imagine the Vietnamese government wants to encourage, things like home ownership and things like investing in more kind of the creation of generational wealth and having less of the population just be dependent on daily wage labor. And so if you're the leadership of this country, you very much want these things to go forward. You want people to have the kind of disposable income and the kind of economic stability that make them possible. So Vietnam to me is, Korea is different. Korea has a quite big and quite robust middle class that it is the current government is trying to protect. And that's a kind of simpler endeavor. There are fuel price caps, there's targeted consumer vouchers from the country. And as long as this doesn't go on too long, South Korea can kind of minimize the damage. But for Vietnam, I would just say the policymakers there are dealing with a different phenomenon where they are trying to maintain momentum and trying to take a sort of developmental leap. So I would say they have a different and more challenging calculus, and they have to be hoping that it's out of their hands. The bigger questions of the war in the Middle East are out of their hands, but they have to be hoping that for the long-term development of the country that this conflict really doesn't last too long.
Right, of course not. Keeping in mind the respective national interests that Steven just mentioned, Professor Kim, then what are some of the areas that can be further advanced through partnership between South Korea and Vietnam?
Well, the recent conflicts in the Middle East has caused significant disruptions to global supply chains, emphasizing the vulnerability of traditional maritime routes and energy dependencies. Vietnam, as the world's second largest holder of rare earth element, serves as the critical hub for Korea's semiconductor and electronic vehicle battery industries, ensuring a stable flow of materials that bypasses geopolitically sensitive regions. In terms of security, both nations act as stabilizers by enhancing maritime security cooperation and safeguarding sea lines of communication. Furthermore, Vietnam serves as a unique diplomatic mediator for the Korean Peninsula. By sharing the institutional framework of the Doi Moi reforms, Vietnam provides a viable socio-economic roadmap for North Korea's potential transition and integration into the global economy, where the foundation of this partnership remains people-centered. As of late 2025, the number of Korea-Vietnam multicultural families has exceeded 100,000, creating a substantial demographic bridge. Developing educational and legal support systems for these families and their children is essential to transform this demographic shift into a strategic asset for a genuine partnership between the two countries.
Right, for sure. And that particular issue was also mentioned by President Lee Jae Myung during his luncheon with the Korean community in Hanoi on this Wednesday. Stephen, on the geopolitical front, what perhaps are the common challenges that the two countries, South Korea and Vietnam, can seek to address together?
Well, I also thought of Vietnam's role on the Korean Peninsula, as Professor Kim just laid out. I mean, I would also mention that Tô Lâm visited North Korea in October of last year. He's one of relatively few world leaders that has had that kind of access to the North. So I have to imagine that maybe at a dinner tonight or in some other kind of quiet, away from the spotlight moment, President Lee might bring that up and he might say, how did that go? What did you learn on that trip? And is there a possibility that, as it kind of has in the past, like let's not forget in 2019, Vietnam was the site of the summit between US President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Could Vietnam act as a kind of dialogue channel or a potential venue for the exchanging of information, the exchanging of views between North and South? If President Lee is planning a more decisive olive branch dialogue push to North Korea before the end of his term, I think he would probably be wise to check with Vietnam just about their experiences and what they're hearing, and if it's possible that they maybe like pass along a message or something to that effect. And also just Vietnam is often touted as a potential that North Korea has a chance at a kind of potential path that similar to what Vietnam has taken, like going from being a quite restrictive communist state to being a pretty open economy, a flourishing trade-oriented economy, but that has retained a lot of the characteristics of its political system. It's still not, a liberal democracy by any means. It's still not a country where you can speak freely or criticize the leaders as much as some people might like to, but its living standards and its health indicators and all those things have improved markedly. So it's something to watch, and it's something that I think the people in the Lee administration who are responsible for North Korean policy, it's an area that they would be looking to more, I think.
Right, and speaking about the Lee Jae Myung administration, Professor Kim, this particular visit to Vietnam follows a similar visit to India earlier this week. How do you assess the administration's diplomatic efforts thus far?
Well, Lee Jae Myung administration's foreign policy is defined by pragmatic autonomous diplomacy, which emphasize national interest over ideological considerations. In the face of intensifying U.S.-China rivalry, the government seeks to secure a strategic space that allows South Korea to diversify its diplomatic options without taking side. The implementation of this strategy involves cooperation with the Global South, with a particular focus on ASEAN and India to cultivate the strategic third space. This approach facilitates risk mitigation and ensures policy flexibility during period of global uncertainty. However, I think notable constraints rise in the administration's heavy reliance on economic-centric engagement during high-level summits. While economic cooperation is essential, it is very important, but it does not automatically translate into socio-political trust. Sustainable partnership requires shared values and deeper mutual trust and understanding, which in turn makes economic cooperation more resilient. South Korea must transcend its transactional framework and emerge as a sincere, reliable partner across both economic and geopolitical dimensions. That's it.
Right. We have about a minute left. Steven, speaking as a foreign journalist based here in South Korea, how would you assess the administration's diplomatic efforts thus far?
Well, I'm just going to remind myself and the audience that I'm an objective reporter who keeps his opinions to himself. So I would just refer to what we know of the assessments of the South Korean public, and I would just say that Lee Jae Myung's approval ratings are quite high. They're in the high 60%, I think, and the Lee administration will face its first electoral test on June 3rd in the form of local elections. And if you look at poll data for those, the DP is leading in pretty much every major riding. They're even leading in the city of Daegu, which is known as South Korea's most conservative city. And I wouldn't say that foreign policy is the only reason, or maybe even not even the main reason for that. But for Lee to have oriented his foreign policy in a way where, according to the national interests, like he says, pragmatically, like he says, that's a very persuasive and a very easy to sell message to the South Korean public, I think. For him to say that he is going to orient South Korea's external relations in a way that benefits the country, the way that benefits regular South Koreans in the forms of trade and economic development, and not sticking to any kind of ideological framework, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that it's going over quite well with the public here.
Right, indeed. Well, we'll see that pragmatic diplomacy in action later today in Hanoi, as well as, of course, Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy, as Professor Kim mentioned earlier. All right, Steven, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Professor Kim, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. We return same time tomorrow with more panel discussion on the summit in Hanoi. Do join us then. Thank you for now.